I teach and research in environmental law, and I teach lots of modules on the environmental law and policy specialism. I have to say, we're particularly proud of our specialism. We're the top rated in the country. I think we're third in the world according to the LLM guide. And we have wonderful, not our LLM year is wonderful, but we have an incredible collection of alumni who regularly come back and are part of our community, come to our events, connect with our new LLM cohorts, and one of them is here tonight and is going to be talking to you, Sophie, so she can tell you what it was really like. I'm going to talk to you about a problem, and I think that's the brief tonight, is that we're going to tell you about some of the kinds of things we will teach you about on the LLM, or the kinds of issues you will look at. And it is a kind of a talk ask to think about what is an issue that we can tell you about that you're going to study on your LLM in 10 minutes, considering the aim of the LLM is to go deep into... but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about air quality, because it's a topical issue, and also because it's something I research, and I think it's a nice example of the kinds of questions that we think about when we're thinking about advanced legal study in relation to environmental problems. So what are we thinking about when we're thinking about governing air quality? Well, air quality is a problem in many countries, in many major cities around the world. It's a problem that is the result of urbanisation, of agricultural practices, of industrial practices, and so on. And it's often thought of, in policy terms, as a medical problem or a scientific problem. So this is kind of a slide where I'm trying to get you to think about the fact that we can think about this problem in different ways. And our awareness about the problem and our knowledge about the problem really comes from doctors and scientists. And public awareness has been generated by knowledge developments in those disciplines. But increasingly, as knowledge in those areas develops around air pollution, certainly in this jurisdiction, but in other countries around the world as well, it's become increasingly a legal problem. And I will talk to you a bit tonight about why that's the case. But even in, you don't need to do an LLM to know it's a legal problem, certainly in this jurisdiction, because we have a lot of very high-profile litigation that's been brought against the government for the government's attempts to regulate air quality and for the fact that they've not been robust enough. There's been a whole series of cases brought by an organisation called Client Earth, which you may or may not have heard about, which are some nods from the students who are hoping to do the environmental law specialism. And it is a legal problem increasingly. It's also a problem that is very much a moving target, because our knowledge about air quality and air pollution is something that is always evolving. And this is something that creates real challenges for regulating and governing air quality as a problem, as it does for many environmental problems. Lack of scientific knowledge, scientific uncertainty is a common characteristic of many environmental issues, and a real challenge for thinking about how they are treated legally and how they might be regulated. In fact, the history of air quality regulation is a history of finding new targets and new regulatory targets and law adjusting once they've been identified. If we think about the 1950s in this country with great smogs, that provoked one kind of legal response. Right now, we're particularly concerned with traffic, nitrogen dioxide emissions, and in the future, I can tell what's coming down the line, we're going to be worrying about indoor pollution, ultrafine particles, and ground level ozone. There are phases of air pollution, and law needs to react to this developing knowledge about our air quality. Why I've got this picture up, which is from the government's clean air strategy, is just to illustrate visually that this air quality is not an easy problem to address, partly because of the fact that our knowledge is developing, but also because it's what we call a classic collective action problem. It results from lots of different kinds of sources, lots of different kinds of behaviours. It's very polycentric, is one way we would describe it. It results from transport, agriculture, shipping, how we heat our homes, planning decisions, in addition to, and they're the kinds of things that we make decisions about as societies, about how we are going to heat our homes, design our transport systems, what kind of agriculture policy we have, and so on. And there are things that we can't control, in particular the weather. These things combine to produce our picture of air quality. What is important in seeing this kind of overall collective picture is that any attempt to grapple with air quality as a problem is fundamentally a coordination problem of seeing how these different spheres of activity might be controlled, addressed and coordinated to make sure that our overall air quality is acceptable. Now, in the UK, we are legally required to have plans for our air quality. And the plans are what we're going to do to make sure our air quality is kept within legally acceptable limits. We have air quality standards set in law, and we have had, since 2015, a whole series of plans because we have been in breach of various air quality standards. And not only are we legally required to have these plans are legally scrutinised, and they have been challenged in court multiple times. That's where the Client Earth litigation has come in, and they have been found to be unlawful twice, and now we have, at this point, what is a lawful plan for air quality. However, there's something really interesting in the framing of our current air quality plan. It's all about, which is this plan that hasn't been crossed out, supplemented by a few other documents, which you need to read together, which is one thing you will learn on the LLM. Read more documents, try and make sense of them all. Lots of documents. But this picture is really interesting because at the moment, the UK frames, and it's not alone in this kind of framing, but it frames air pollution as a local problem. And what I mean by that is it says that local authorities are at the front line for controlling air pollution, for identifying and controlling air pollution. Now that framing means it's seen as an issue of hotspots at traffic junctions that need to be fixed. The problem with this is that it conflates the local impacts and knowledge about air pollution with who can actually control the sources, which, as you can see here, are not just about traffic lights and making sure that a traffic junction works well. They're much more widespread. So we have an approach to air quality which is trying to simplify the problem, to narrow down the target, to find the regulatory actor that's going to solve the problem. And the reason why that approach is not really working, because we're still not achieving the air quality standards we want to achieve, is that local authorities are not the only regulatory actors that have control over air pollution sources. And this is just an illustration to give you an idea of that there are other public bodies that control sources of air pollution. Highways England, Civil Aviation Authority that look after highways, airports and so on. There are other public actors that control sources of air pollution that are currently not within the legal picture for governing air quality. Which raises a question about how does our current framing of air pollution and how we govern it map onto who actually controls the sources of air pollution. Now, this is some of the research I do, is try and look at the governance of air pollution, who the administrative actors are, how well they are involved in the picture of governing air quality. What is the role of law, though, in this picture of who might be responsible for air quality, who should be responsible for air quality, and how the governance for air quality might be constructed? Now, and this is why it's worth doing an LLM, there's lots of law that is relevant to air quality, unsurprisingly. Air quality and air pollution is a transboundary issue. There are international dimensions to dealing with air pollution as a problem. Air pollution moves across borders, and we have, therefore, a big international treaty on air pollution. We have lots of EU law on air pollution. The EU is a particularly competent actor in air quality, ranging from setting big global air quality standards to regulating emissions from motor vehicles to regulating emissions from industrial installations. In addition, we have planning law at the national level. We have an Environment Act that has a whole section on air quality. And they are dealing with different domains of legal control, not just at a multi-level kind of governance perspective, but adopting different regulatory strategies, different reacting to different aspects of the air pollution problem. We have lots of air quality law, but it's not working. So the questions that we, a law school want to answer is, why is it not working? Why is this picture not working? What is it, first of all? It's quite complicated to see, but why is it not working? And it's not working for a whole host of reasons. It's legally incredibly complex. The problem of air pollution is still being understood, so there are gaps, and that's the point about scientific uncertainty I raised earlier. There are compromised standards in this legal picture. The current EU standards don't yet reflect WHO guidelines on air pollution. Many of these regulations and requirements are poorly implemented. There's cheating involved. You may have heard of the Volkswagen scandal, with cheap defeat devices being put on cars to mask their genuine emissions in the real world. There's an over-reliance on certain actors like local authorities to be the primary actors to control air pollution, and not sufficiently coordinating the different actors who have a stake in controlling our sources of air pollution. There's also a lot of legal change afoot in this particular jurisdiction with Brexit, and that's what you've got, that last reference in the bottom of the slide. Some EU exit regulations that already complicate our legal picture. How do we fix this? And this is where we start to ask important academic questions about this legal picture. We would ask, what's a robust and acceptable regulatory standard for having good air quality? We always, if we live in urbanised societies, we are going to accept a level of pollution. But what's an acceptable level of pollution that's not harmful to health and harmful to our environment? What's the best regulatory strategy for dealing with this problem? And we learn on the environmental law specialism about different kinds of regulatory strategies. Not just descriptively, like what are the kinds of strategies you could have? Bans, design controls, planning controls, various things. But how do you know what's a good strategy to adopt? Are different strategies more legitimate than others? Are different strategies more just and fair? And there are real justice problems in dealing with air quality, because certain parts of our populations that live in cities tend to be more adversely affected by air pollution than others, often those who are in more deprived circumstances. What's realistic? What's effective? And then, beyond regulatory strategy, how do we think about our government? How do we think about organising public administration to govern this problem well? It's a problem of structuring the state as much as it is of designing new forms of control. They're the kind of questions we would look at. What to keep an eye out for next? What's coming in this area? Because it is a very fast-moving area. And keep an eye out for three things. One is there has been a series of private members' bills brought in the UK Parliament. For those of you who are from the United Kingdom might be more interested in this, but still it's very interesting. Because governments can be slow to bring about environmental legislation, but they won't at the moment, but they tend to be slow to bring about environmental legislation. There might be one slot every 5 years to bring in a new piece of law, and this has been a really, really hot topic. Various members of the House of Lords have brought in private members' bills, which are really interesting. Often private members' bills are, but there are some really interesting private members' bills which have gotten better and better over time. And watch the space for whether we get another clean air bill proposed in Parliament. In the meantime, however, any day now in this country we will get a new environment bill, which has a whole new section of law to add to that slide about all our air quality law that doesn't replace any of the things that we've got, adds a whole new area of air quality law to look at, which is full of all sorts of challenges. And some innovations, and will be something that we will need to look at very closely. And the third thing to keep an eye out for is a lot of campaigning. So there's something called the Healthy Air Campaign in this country, which is a very powerful alliance of lots of different NGOs and other interests who support having cleaner air. And it's interesting, you don't often get law being part of a public interest campaign for health, but one of their central planks is that there need to be stronger laws for clean air. Now, what you can think about on the LLM is, what do we mean by a stronger law? But I'll leave that with you. Okay, thank you.